The fire in the salon at Ajaccio spits and hisses, casting warping shadows across the stone walls. A boy of 9, small for his age with skin the color of sun-scorched olive, kneels on the cold granite floor. He is not praying. His small, ink-stained fingers trace the grooves between the stones, feeling the grit of century. Outside, the wind carries the salt of the Mediterranean and the distant, guttural shouts of French revolutionary soldiers patrolling the narrow streets of Corsica. The air inside smells of burning chestnut wood, lavender, and the metallic tang of his mother, Letizia, stands motionless by the window, her hand pressed against her belly, swollen with another child, her eyes fixed on the harbor where French flags now snap in the salty breeze. The boy looks up at her, searching for the crack in her composure, the tremble of a woman conquered. He finds none. Her jaw is a marble ledge, her silence a command. In that moment, the boy, Napoleon III Bonaparte, understands a truth that will shape the blood-soaked soil of Europe. Power is not a throne you inherit. It is a fortress you build, stone by stone, with your own bare hands. While the world burns around you, he looks down at his fingers, still tracing the floor, and makes a silent vow to never be the one kneeling on the cold stone. To understand the weight of the crown they wore, we must first walk the scorched earth that forged their ambition. The Mediterranean sun bakes the whitewashed walls of Ajaccio, but it cannot warm the chill that settles in the Bonaparte household in the spring of 1769. France has come to Corsica. The year before, the island's fierce independence, led by the hero Pasquale Paoli, had crumbled under the weight of a French invasion. Now, the conquerors are here to stay, their language a foreign growl on the streets, their tax collectors a new kind of predator. In a modest 4-story house on the Rue Malherbe, Carlo Bonaparte, a charming and ambitious lawyer with a taste for silk waistcoats he cannot quite afford, makes a decision that will define the life of his second son, Napoleon. He decides to bend the knee. Carlo travels to the French mainland to meet with the new governor, Comte de Marbu. He carries with him letters of nobility, documents proving the Bonapartes were minor Tuscan nobles. He carries, too, the weight of his own ambition. In the halls of power, Carlo is a quick study. He learns to speak the conqueror's language, to laugh at his jokes, to admire the shine of his boots. He secures for his sons, Joseph and Napoleon, scholarships to French military school. For Carlo, it is a negotiation for survival, a path forward through a broken door. But for the boy left behind in Ajaccio, listening to his mother Letizia's sharp, rhythmic steps as she moves through the house, her back straighter than any French general, it feels like a betrayal. Letizia Ramolino does not bend. She is the daughter of a Swiss mercenary, a woman who married Carlo at 14 and was pregnant at 15. When the French invaded, she was in the hills, a rifle at her side, her children clinging to her skirts as the fighting raged. She has the eyes of a hawk and a spine of forged iron. She never learns to write French properly, and she never trusts the French. In the dark of the Ajaccio house, when the shutters are closed against the prying eyes of the new regime, she whispers to her children in the Corsican dialect. She tells them of Paoli, the liberator. She tells them of the blood of their ancestors, men who fought the Genoese, who fought anyone who dared place a boot on their rocky soil. She tells them that names are not given, they are earned and defended. For Napoleon, the boy with the sharp, angular face and the burning, restless eyes, he lives in the space between his father's compromise and his mother's defiance. It is a space that teaches him two things: that the world is a chessboard of alliances, and that the only person you can truly rely on is yourself. When he is 9, he and his older brother Joseph are sent away. The journey across the sea is a torment. The water is a churning gray, the ship's wood groaning like a wounded animal. Joseph, soft and amiable, cries for their mother. Napoleon does not. He stands at the rail, his knuckles white against the wood, staring at the Corsican coast until it disappears into the haze. He does not speak again until they reach the mainland. The French military school at Brienne-le-Château is a monastery of cold stone and colder discipline. The air smells of boiled cabbage, chalk dust, and damp wool. Napoleon arrives with a thick Corsican accent, a small allowance that barely covers his needs, and a fierce, silent pride. The other boys, sons of French aristocrats, smell his poverty and his foreignness like blood in the water. They mock him. They call him a Corsican savage, a peasant who has no right to wear the king's uniform. They laugh at his patched clothes, his inability to dance, his obsession with books and mathematics. But Napoleon does not retreat. He learns their language, but he refuses to forget his own. He builds walls around his heart. In the cold, drafty dormitories, by the light of a candle stub, he devours history. He reads Caesar's commentary, the campaigns of Alexander, the strategic genius of Frederick the Great. He maps out battles in the snow during winter exercises, his small figure commanding a brigade of younger boys who begin to look to him, not for friendship, but for strategy. He is not liked, but he is respected. And for a boy who has learned that love is a weakness, respect is enough. His father's visits are rare and strange. Carlo, now a French-appointed representative for Corsica, arrives with a flourish, his wig powdered, his manner ingratiated. He speaks of advancement, of connections. He tells his son to be patient, to smile, to fit in. Napoleon listens in silence. He sees his father as a man who sold his pride for a seat at the conqueror's table. He vows in the quiet of his own mind to never be that man. He will not sit at the table, he will own the table. The letter arrives on a February day in 1785. Napoleon is 16. He unfolds the paper in his small room, the ink smudged from the journey across the sea. His father, Carlo, is dead. He reads the words once, then again. He does not weep. He folds the letter carefully and places it in the pocket of his worn coat. His father had been a weak man, he tells himself. A man who smiled too much, who compromised too easily. But in the silence of the room, the boy feels the floor drop out from beneath him. His mother is now alone in Ajaccio with 7 children. The meager allowance from the crown stops. He is the man of the house now. He must become harder, sharper, faster. He graduates early and is commissioned as a second lieutenant in the La Fère artillery regiment. The uniform is too large for his thin frame, but he wears it with a severity that makes men look twice. He is posted to Valence, then to Auxonne. The years between 1785 and 1792 are a blur of study and solitude. He earns almost nothing, sending most of his pay home to Letizia. He lives on bread and coffee, his body lean, his mind a constantly sharpening blade. He pores over artillery manuals, memorizing trajectories, burn rates, the geometry of destruction. He writes treatises on how to defend a coastline, how to deploy a battery. He is not just learning to fire a cannon, he is learning to command the thunder. And all the while, the world outside his small garrison is catching fire. The French Revolution tears down the Bastille. It strips the aristocrats of their titles, the same aristocrats whose sons mocked him at Brienne. It screams of liberty, equality, and fraternity. For Napoleon, the Corsican outsider, it is a revelation. The revolution opens doors that were previously locked and bolted. For the first time, a man's destiny is not determined by his birth, but by his talent. He throws himself into the cause. He returns to Corsica, now a lieutenant in a revolutionary army, and finds his homeland in chaos. Paoli, the old liberator, has turned against the revolution, seeking to make Corsica independent with British help. Napoleon faces the most agonizing decision of his young life. His family is caught in the crossfire. His mother, the indomitable Letizia, is in Ajaccio with his sibling, their home now a target for Paoli's vengeful follower. In the summer of 1793, the Bonapartes become fugitives on the island of their birth. They flee, piling into a small boat in the dead of night, the oars muffled with rags. Napoleon, now a captain, stands in the bow, his eyes scanning the dark water, a pistol in his belt. Behind him, his mother sits rigid, her children huddled around her. As the Corsican coast recedes into the darkness, Letizia does not look back. Napoleon watches her. He sees a woman who has lost a husband, a home, a nation, and still refuses to bend. In that moment, she becomes the blueprint for everything he becomes. He brings his family to the French mainland. They are refugees, penniless, dependent on his captain's salary. They live in cramped quarters in Toulon, the air thick with the salt and the desperation of a city on the brink. Napoleon feels the weight of them, his mother's unwavering expectation, his siblings' hungry mouths, Joseph's gentle incompetence, Lucien's burning radicalism, the little ones, Louis, Pauline, Caroline, Jerome, who look to him as a father. He is 24 years old, and he is the patriarch of a fallen clan. But the revolution is a forge, and it is his time. The port of Toulon is in rebellion. The British fleet has sailed into the harbor, their red-coated marines marching through the streets, threatening to crush the revolution on its own soil. The French Republic's army is incompetent, its generals bickering, indecisive. A desperate representative from the government, a man named Paul Barons, needs an artillery officer who understands how to take a fortress. Napoleon is given a chance. In the winter of 1793, on the heights surrounding Toulon, he finds his stage. The rain falls in relentless sheets, turning the hillsides into rivers of mud. The British hold the forts, their cannons commanding the harbor. The French have tried and failed to dislodge them. Napoleon sees what the other generals cannot. He points to a small promontory called Fort Galette. "Take that," he says, his voice calm, his finger tracing the map, "and the British fleet will burn." He does not wait for permission. He seizes the cannons from the surrounding countryside, dragging them up the muddy slopes with his own men. He works through the nights, his uniform soaked, his hands raw, his eyes glowing with the certainty of a man who has finally found his purpose. He is not a Corsican outcast anymore. He is the architect of victory. When the final assault comes, he leads it. A British musket ball tears through his horse. Another grazes his thigh. He does not stop. He plants the tricolor flag on the ramparts as the British ships, their anchors cut, blaze in the harbor below. Toulon falls. In one night, a captain becomes a brigadier general. He is 24. The name Bonaparte begins to be spelled in the French way, Bonaparte. It is a small change, a shedding of the Corsican shell. But for the young general, it is more than a name. It is a declaration. He has taken his father's shame and his mother's steel and forged them into a weapon. He has a family to feed, a name to build, a destiny to claim. And as he stands in the smoking ruins of Toulon, watching the embers of the British fleet sink into the Mediterranean, he does not see an end. He sees a beginning. The stone in the shoe of the French Republic has become the boot that will soon kick down the doors of Europe. But first, he must secure his home. He must build an arsenal, and that arsenal will not be made of iron alone. It will be made of blood, his blood, the blood of the Bonapartes. The ink on his promotion is barely dry when General Bonaparte, age 26, receives a command that will transform him from a provincial artillery officer into the most feared name in Europe. The army of Italy is starving, shoeless, and demoralized, scattered along the Ligurian coast. The Directory in Paris gives him this command not as a reward, but as a way to dispose of a young general whose ambition has already begun to make the old men nervous. They expect him to fail. They expect the Austrian Empire, the most powerful military machine on the continent, to grind him into the Alpine mud. What they do not understand is that Bonaparte does not fight wars the way other men fight wars. He fights them the way a starving man hunts. He arrives in Nice in March of 1796, a slight figure in a gray overcoat, his face gaunt, his eyes carrying the sleepless energy of a predator who has caught the scent. His officers, veterans of years of hard campaigning, look at him with barely concealed contempt. They call him a little upstart, a political general who has never led men in a major battle. Bonaparte does not give a speech. He does not try to win their affection. He looks at the maps spread across the table, at the reports of Austrian forces massing in the Piedmont, and he begins to issue orders. His voice is high and thin, but it carries the absolute certainty of a man who has already seen the outcome in his mind. He will not defend. He will attack. He will drive a wedge between the Austrians and their Piedmontese allies. He will live off the land, move faster than any army has ever moved, and he will not stop until the enemy is shattered. He writes to his brother Joseph, now serving as his aide-de-camp, with a cold, clinical clarity. "We will march at night to surprise the enemy, take them in the flank, and crush them." There is no hesitation in the words, no contemplation of failure. For Bonaparte, failure is not a possibility. It is a luxury he cannot afford. Behind him, in the cramped lodgings he has secured for his family in Marseille, his mother Letizia waits. His siblings wait. They depend on his victories for their bread, their status, their very survival. He is not just fighting for France. He is fighting for the Bonaparte name, the name his father sullied with compromise, the name his mother preserved through exile. He will make it a name that kings will whisper in fear. The campaign that follows is a masterclass in velocity and violence. Bonaparte does not fight pitched battles in the old style. He maneuvers. He marches his army across the Apennines in the dead of winter, the roads slick with ice, the men coughing up blood from the cold. He appears where the enemy least expects him. At Montenat, at Millesimo, at Seva, he strikes with the speed of a serpent. The Austrians and their Piedmontese allies cannot coordinate. They are always one step behind, reacting to a shadow. The young general is everywhere. his gray overcoat mud-splattered, his voice hoarse from shouting orders, his body sustained by nothing but coffee and raw ambition. He sleeps 2 hours a night, if he sleeps at all. He writes dispatches by candlelight while the shells fall around his headquarters. He does not ask his men to do anything he would not do himself, and they begin to see it. They begin to believe. On May 10, 1796, at the bridge of Lodi, Bonaparte earns their fanatical devotion. The Austrians have fortified the far bank of the Adda River, their cannons aimed at a narrow wooden bridge that seems to invite slaughter. Bonaparte's generals advise caution. They advise waiting for reinforcements. Bonaparte looks at the bridge, looks at the Austrian guns, and makes a decision that will define his legend. He orders the advance. He takes a drum and beats the charge himself, standing at the head of his grenadiers as they pour across the bridge, the Austrian grape shot tearing through their ranks. Men fall screaming into the brown water below. The column wavers. Bonaparte is there, his face black with powder, his hand gripping the regimental flag. He does not flinch. He does not retreat. The grenadiers see their general, a man who could have stayed safely in the rear, standing in the mouth of hell beside them. They surge forward. They cross the bridge. They take the Austrian guns. Lodi is a small tactical victory, but it is a psychological earthquake. Bonaparte's men give him a new name, the Little Corporal, not as an insult, as a badge of honor. He is one of them, but he is more than them. He is their instrument of victory. In the flush of this triumph, Bonaparte writes to his brother Joseph with a new kind of hunger. "I have only one passion," he writes from his headquarters in Milan, the former capital of Austrian power in Italy. "One mistress, that is France. I sleep with her. She never fails me." But even as he writes these words, he is about to meet a woman who will become the second great obsession of his life, a woman who will entwine the fate of the Bonaparte family with her own fierce, complicated heart. Her name is Rose de Beauharnais, though Bonaparte will rename her Josephine. She is 6 years his senior, a Creole widow from Martinique with 2 children, and a past that includes a lover's scandal and a narrow escape from the guillotine. She is sensual, elegant, and politically astute in ways that the rough Corsican general cannot fathom. When they meet in the salons of Paris after his Italian victory, she sees in him something raw and powerful, a force of nature wrapped in an ill-fitting uniform. He sees in her something he has never known, a woman who does not bend to his will, who remains a mystery, a challenge. He falls in love with the desperation of a man who has conquered armies but never a heart. He writes to her constantly, letters of fevered passion that she sometimes does not even open. He signs them, "Your slave, Bonaparte." It is an inversion of everything he is, and it is the first crack in his armor. They marry in a civil ceremony in March 1796, just days before he departs for Italy. The marriage is hurried, almost furtive. Bonaparte lies about his age to make the gap between them seem smaller. He is 26. He claims to be 28. Josephine's family and friends whisper that she is marrying a man who will never be more than a successful general, that his Corsican family is coarse and grasping. They do not understand what is growing inside this man. They cannot see that Italy is just the beginning. While Bonaparte conquers the old world in Italy, his family begins to stake their claim on the new world he is building. Joseph, the elder brother, is given diplomatic posts, then military commands he does not deserve. Lucien, the radical, fiery brother, becomes a political force in France, using his oratory to support Napoleon's rise while pursuing his own Jacobin loyalties. Louis, the quiet, melancholic brother, is brought into the army, forced into a role he never asked for. And Letizia, the mother, watches it all from the periphery, saying little, spending little, keeping her own accounts. When her sons send her lavish gifts from Italy, paintings, jewels, silks, she accepts them with a nod and locks them away. She knows that fortune is a weak, and she has seen it turn too many times to trust its present height. But the family's growing power is also its greatest vulnerability. In Italy, Bonaparte's victories have made him the most powerful man in France, more powerful than the Directory that appointed him. The politicians in Paris look at him with fear and jealousy. They want to use his glory, but they want to contain the man himself. Bonaparte understands this. He knows that the Directory will eventually turn on him, that his fame is a weapon that can be used against him as easily as he uses it against the Austrian. He needs a new kind of glory, a new kind of conquest that will make him indispensable. He needs to become not just a general, but a legend. Egypt is the answer. In the summer of 1798, he sails from Toulon with 400 ships and 54,000 men, bound for the land of the Pharaoh. He tells his troops they will open a new route to India, that they will strike at the British Empire through its most vulnerable flank. But in his private letters, the ambition is more naked. He writes to his brother Joseph, "If I take Egypt, I take the world." The campaign is a fever dream of glory and catastrophe. Bonaparte wins the Battle of the Pyramids, his disciplined divisions shattering the Mamluk cavalry with a tactic he calls the divisional square, massed infantry forming walls of steel that the horsemen cannot break. He stands on the Giza Plateau, the pyramids rising behind him like monuments to ancient ambition, and he tells his men that 40 centuries look down upon them. He believes it. He believes history is watching, waiting to crown him. But Nelson's British fleet finds the French anchored at Ajaccio Bay. In the Battle of the Nile, the British admiral destroys Bonaparte's fleet, stranding the French army in Egypt with no hope of reinforcement or retreat. Bonaparte is trapped. The campaign that was meant to make him the master of the East has become a prison. The Egyptian desert swallows his army. The men die of plague, of dysentery, of wounds that fester in the merciless sun. Bonaparte's own health fails. He suffers from a skin disease, from bouts of fever that leave him shaking and weak. He pushes on anyway, leading an ill-fated campaign into Syria, besieging the fortress of Acre with an army decimated by disease. Acre holds. The British naval commander, Sir Sidney Smith, anchors his ships off the coast and supplies the Ottoman defenders with everything they need to resist. Bonaparte's siege guns, sent by sea, are captured by the British. He is forced to retreat to Egypt, his dreams of Asian empire crumbling into the sand. It is in the shadow of Acre that Bonaparte receives the letter that will change everything. It is from Joseph, smuggled through the British blockade. The news from France is chaos. The Directory is collapsing. The Austrians and Russians are advancing on all fronts. The revolution that gave Bonaparte his opportunity is eating itself alive. Joseph writes that the time is now, that France is waiting for a savior, that Bonaparte must return. The decision is instantaneous. Bonaparte abandons his army. He leaves General Kleber to negotiate a surrender with the British, to hold the remnants of the Egyptian dream together while he slips away in the night. He takes a small frigate, the Muirin, and runs the British blockade. On board with him are his most trusted generals, Berthier, Lannes, Murat, and the scientific commission he brought to Egypt, the scholars and artists who will become the foundation of a new kind of cultural conquest. But there is someone missing, Josephine. While Bonaparte was in Egypt, his wife had remained in Paris. The letters she did not answer, the rumors of her affair with a handsome cavalry officer named Hippolyte Charles, had festered in the general's mind. The Egyptian son, the isolation, the failure, it all fed a burning, irrational jealousy. When he lands in France in October 1799, he does not go to her first. He goes to his family. He goes to Letizia. He goes to Joseph and Lucien. He gathers his clan around him and tells them what they already know. The Directory is weak, the Republic is dying, and only one man can save it. Only one family. The coup of 18 Brumaire is a family affair. Lucien, who has become president of the Council of 500, is the inside man. He uses his political authority to create a crisis, then to legitimize the coup after it happened. Joseph organizes the support of key military commander. Letizia, as always, watches and says nothing, but her presence in the background is a silent endorsement of everything her sons are doing. On the day of the coup, Bonaparte addresses the Council of 500 in the Palace of St. Cloud. It goes wrong. The deputies who have not been part of the conspiracy scream at him. They call him a dictator, a new Caesar. They crowd around him, shouting, pushing. Bonaparte's face goes white. He stammers. He is the conqueror of Italy, the master of Egypt, and he cannot find the words to take power by persuasion. His guards have to drag him from the chamber, but Lucien does not panic. He mounts a horse outside the palace and tells the soldiers that the deputies have tried to assassinate his brother, that the Republic is in danger. It is a lie, but it is a beautiful lie, and the soldiers believe. They march into the chamber at bayonet point and disperse the deputy. That night, a rump parliament votes to abolish the Directory and establish a three-man consulate. Bonaparte is the first consul. He has the power. He has the state. The family has delivered him the throne, though the crown is still invisible. Later that night in the quiet of the Tuileries Palace, Bonaparte finally confronts Josephine. The marriage has been strained beyond breaking. He tells her he will divorce her. He brings his brothers into the room, making them witnesses to her humiliation. Joseph and Lucien stand in the shadows, silent, watching the woman they have always resented. The Creole widow they believe has too much influence over their brother. Josephine falls to her knees. She weeps. She pleads. She brings her children, Eugene and Hortense, into the room, and they kneel beside her, begging their stepfather to forgive their mother. Bonaparte's face is a mask of cold fury, but he looks at these children, the son who followed him through the Italian campaign, the daughter who has always treated him with kindness. He looks at the woman on her knees, the woman who held the salons that kept his name alive while he was stranded in Egypt. He cannot do it. He helps her to her feet. He dismisses his brothers with a wave of his hand. The family is preserved, but the fault line is now visible. Joseph and Lucien will never forgive Josephine for this moment, and Josephine will never forget that the brothers tried to destroy her. The Bonaparte family has become an arsenal. Each sibling is a weapon, a tool, a potential threat. Napoleon has given them power, but power, he is learning, has its own gravity. It pulls everything toward it. It bends loyalty. It creates jealousies that no battlefield victory cure. As the new century dawns, the first consul stands at the window of the Tuileries, looking out at the city of Paris, the city he now commands. Behind him, his mother sits by the fire, knitting, her needles clicking like the steady beat of a harp. He knows what she knows. The family is his strength and his weakness. He will make them kings. He will make them queen. He will bind them to him with titles and lands and the blood of Europe's old dynasty. But in binding them, he will also arm them. And the day may come when those arms are turned against him. For now, though, there is only forward. There is only more. The Republic is dead. The Empire is waiting, and the Bonapartes are ready to claim it. The morning of December 2, 1804, dawns over Paris with a cold, pale light that does nothing to warm the stone of Notre Dame Cathedral. For weeks, the city has transformed itself into a stage. Carpenters have erected tiers of velvet draped seating along the nave. Painters have gilded every column, every capital, every arch. The great bells, silent since the Revolution stripped the church of its sanctity, ring out across the Seine, calling the old world to witness the birth of something it cannot yet name. Inside the cathedral, the air is thick with incense and anticipation. Pope Pius VII has traveled across the Alps, humbling himself to anoint the man who humbled the church. The crowned heads of Europe, those who have not been conquered or cowed, send ambassadors to watch. They come not to celebrate, but to measure the man who has made himself emperor. In the carriage that carries him from the Tuileries to the cathedral, Napoleon sits alone. His brothers, Joseph and Louis, ride in a separate coach, their faces stiff with resentment. His mother, Letizia, has refused to attend. When the news of the coronation reached her in Genoa, where she had retreated from the chaos of Paris, she sent a simple reply. The emperor may do as he pleases. I am his mother. I do not need to see him crowned to know what he is. Some whisper she is angry that Napoleon has not given her sons, and others believe she knows, with the instinct of a woman who has lost a home and rebuilt a family from ashes, that crowns are heavy things, and those who wear them rarely sleep soundly. In the carriage, Napoleon fingers the hilt of his sword. He thinks of his father, Carlo, who bent his knee to the French conquerors so that his sons might have bread. He thinks of the stone floor in Ajaccio, his small fingers tracing the groove. He is 35 years old. He has crossed the Alps with armies, slept on the sands of Egypt, reshaped the laws of France with the stroke of a pen. But nothing has prepared him for this weight. The procession enters the cathedral. The emperor wears a robe of purple velvet, embroidered with golden beads, the symbol he has chosen to replace the Bourbon fleur-de-lis, a link to the Merovingian kings, a claim to an empire older than France itself. His step is measured, his face unreadable. Josephine follows, her gown silver and white, her diamonds catching the candlelight like scattered stars. She carries herself with the grace of a woman who has survived the guillotine, survived exile, survived her husband's rages and his brother's contempt. She knows what this day means. She knows it is her victory as much as his. The ceremony unfolds with the ponderous ritual of century. The Pope blesses the crown, the scepter, the hand of justice. He raises the imperial regalia, his voice echoing through the vaulted stone. But when the moment comes for the crowning, Napoleon does not kneel. He does not wait for the Pope to place the diadem on his head. He takes the crown from the altar, a circlet of gold and laurel leaves modeled on the Caesars, and he places it on his own head. Gesture is swift, deliberate, a statement that reverberates through the cathedral like a cannon shot. The Pope watches, his face a mask of serene acceptance, but his hands tremble. The cardinals shift in their seats. The ambassadors from Austria and Russia exchange glances that speak of wars to come. Napoleon does not see them. He turns to Josephine, who kneels before him, her head bowed. He lifts the smaller crown, the crown of the Empress, and places it on her head himself. He has crowned his love. He has crowned his ambition. In one motion, he has told the world that he owes nothing to God, nothing to tradition, nothing to the old bloodlines. He is emperor because he willed it, and his family will rule because he commands it. The coronation is the beginning, not the end. In the weeks that follow, Napoleon transforms his siblings from the children of a minor Corsican nobleman into the royal house of Europe. Joseph, the eldest, is named King of Naples, and then, when the crown of Spain becomes available, King of Spain. Louis is made King of Holland, though he accepts the throne with a melancholy resignation that will curdle into bitterness. Jerome, the youngest, is given the kingdom of Westphalia, a patchwork state carved from Prussian lands. His sisters are not forgotten. Elisa becomes Grand Duchess of Tuscany, ruling with a shrewd administrative mind that surprises everyone who underestimated her. Pauline, the most beautiful and reckless of the siblings, is given the Duchy of Guastalla. Caroline, the most ambitious, marries Joachim Murat, Napoleon's most dashing cavalry commander, and becomes Queen of Naples after Joseph is moved to Spain. The family is scattered across Europe, a network of thrones connected by blood and bound by the iron will of the man in Paris. But the crowns are not gifts. They are chained. Each sibling is given a constitution to follow, a set of Napoleonic laws to enforce, a trade policy that favors French industry over their own kingdom's prosperity. They are expected to rule as extensions of Napoleon's will, to send troops for his wars, to send revenues for his treasury. Joseph, from his throne in Madrid, writes letters of complaint that Napoleon burns without reading. Louis, in Holland, tries to govern in the interest of his Dutch subjects, resisting the continental system that Napoleon has imposed to blockade Britain. When Louis refuses to enforce the blockade, Napoleon sends troops to occupy Amsterdam and strips his brother of his throne. Louis retreats to a chateau in Bohemia, his heart hardened against the brother who gave him a crown and then took it away. The family that was an arsenal is becoming a collection of resentment, each sibling nursing grievances that fester in the gilded palaces Napoleon built for them. It is Lucien, the brother who saved Napoleon during Brumaire, who delivers the deepest wound. Lucien has married a woman of his own choosing, a commoner named Alexandrine de Blesham, in defiance of Napoleon's command to marry a royal bride for the family's political advantage. When Napoleon demands that Lucien annul the marriage, Lucien refuses. He flees France, sailing to America, then to Italy, where he lives in exile rather than submit to his brother's control. Napoleon never forgives him. The name of Lucien becomes unspoken in the Tuileries, a ghost at the feast of the imperial family. When visitors ask about his brother, Napoleon's jaw tightens, his eyes go cold. He chose a woman over his dynasty, the emperor says. He is dead to me. Through all of this, Letizia watches from the shadows. She lives in Rome, far from the intrigues of Paris, in a palace Napoleon has bought for her. She receives her children when they come to visit, listens to their complaints, offers neither judgment nor counsel. She keeps her own accounts, her own counsel. When Napoleon offers her the title of Imperial Highness, she refuses. "Call me Madame," she tells him. "I was Madame before you were Emperor. I will be Madame after." She accepts a simple carriage, not the gilded coach he wants to give her. She dresses in black as she has since Carlo died, and she never forgets the smell of the boat that carried them from Corsica, the sound of the oars muffled in the night. She knows that empires built on ambition are vulnerable. She is storing her wealth in gold, not in promises. When Napoleon writes to her, demanding she take her rightful place at court, she writes back in her halting French, "My place is where I choose it to." The year 1809 brings the greatest test of the family's cohesion. Austria has declared war again, hoping to break the French Empire while Napoleon is occupied in Spain. The emperor marches east, leaving Josephine in Paris with the administration of the empire. At Wagram, he wins the bloodiest battle of his career, a slaughter that leaves the Austrian army broken but costs him 40,000 men. The peace that follows is not a peace of reconciliation, but a peace of exhaustion, and it forces Napoleon to confront the one weakness his enemies have always exploited. He has no heir. Josephine is 50 years old. She cannot give him a son. The marriage that began in fevered passion has become a partnership of convenience, but even that convenience is wearing thin. Napoleon's siblings have never stopped whispering against her. Caroline, the Queen of Naples, writes letters to her brother detailing Josephine's extravagance, her political meddling, her failure to produce an heir. Joseph, from his throne in Madrid, sends messages urging the emperor to think of the dynasty. Even Letizia in Rome drops a word here and there, not against Josephine personally, but against the uncertainty of a throne with no direct successor. Napoleon resists. He loves Josephine still, or he loves what she represents. The man he was before the crown, the Corsican outsider who won the heart of a Parisian aristocrat. But love, he has learned, is a luxury emperors cannot afford. The decision comes in the fall of 1809. Napoleon summons Josephine to his study at Fontainebleau, the palace where kings have made and unmade dynasties for centuries. The room is dark, the fire low. He stands with his back to her, his hands gripping the marble mantelpiece. She knows what is coming. She has known for months, perhaps years. When he speaks, his voice is the voice of a stranger, the voice of the emperor speaking to a subject. Josephine, he says, I must think of France. I must think of the dynasty. I must have a son. She does not scream. She does not plead as she did in the Tuileries after Egypt. She has too much pride for that now. Her face, lined with the years and the anxieties of empire, remains calm. But her hands, the hands that wore the crown he placed on her head, tremble as she folds them in her lap. I have known this moment would come, she says. I have prepared myself. It is a lie, and they both know it. No preparation can ready a woman for the end of her marriage, the end of her purpose, the end of the dream she built from the ashes of her first husband's execution. But she gives him the dignity of believing her. On December 15, 1809, in the Grand Hall of the Tuileries, the emperor and empress stand before the assembled court. Napoleon reads the statement of divorce in a voice that does not waver. He speaks of his love for Josephine, his gratitude for her devotion, his duty to France. Josephine stands beside him, her eyes dry, her posture perfect. When he finishes, she attempts to read her own statement, but her voice breaks. The court is silent. The candles flicker. She sinks into a chair, her ladies rushing to her side, and Napoleon watches her with an expression that is not relief, not satisfaction, but something closer to grief. He has divorced the woman he loved to marry a womb. The family has won. The dynasty is secured, but something in him, something that was still connected to the boy in Ajaccio, dies in that room. The new wife arrives in the spring of 1810. Marie-Louise of Austria is 18 years old, the daughter of the Emperor Francis I, the same man Napoleon has defeated 4 times. The marriage is a political calculation so cynical it takes the breath of Europe. Napoleon marries the enemy's daughter to legitimize his dynasty, to bind the Habsburgs to the Bonapartes, to announce to the world that his family is not a parvenu collection of Corsican adventurers, but the equals of the oldest blood in Europe. Marie-Louise is young, plump, and docile. She knows nothing of politics, nothing of war, nothing of the man she is marrying except that he is the terror of her father's house. When she crosses the French border, she is stripped of her Austrian clothes, her Austrian servants, her Austrian name. She is remade as a French empress, a vessel for the heir Napoleon requires. The wedding night is a transaction. Napoleon, now 40, approaches his young bride with a calculation that has nothing to do with love. He needs a son. Marie-Louise gives him one within the year. On March 20, 1811, a cannon shot announces the birth of the King of Rome, Napoleon Francois Charles Joseph Bonaparte. Napoleon rushes into the delivery, ignoring the protocols that bar men from such chambers. He lifts the child in his arms, this squalling, red-faced boy who carries his blood, his name, his future. He looks at the infant, and for a moment the mask of the emperor slips. He is a father. He has what he wanted. He has the heir. He parades the child before the court, before the diplomats, before the people of Paris. He commissions paintings of the infant in his cradle, the imperial eagle watching over him. He writes to his mother in Rome, the letter bursting with pride. She writes back, her words measured, her congratulations sincere, but her caution unmistakable. "A son is a blessing," she writes. "But sons grow, and sons have their own mind." Napoleon reads the letter, frowns, and sets it aside. He does not understand what his mother is trying to tell him. He has spent his life building the family, elevating the Bonapartes from Corsican obscurity to the thrones of Europe. He believes he has bound them to him with blood and gold and the shared memory of poverty. He does not see that he has also armed them with kingdom, with armies, with the same ambition that drove him from the stone floor of Ajaccio. The family is no longer an arsenal controls. It is a constellation of ambitions, each sibling a star pulling in its own direction. The empire is at its height. The crown is secure. The heir is born, but the shadows are lengthening. In the palaces of Madrid, Naples, and Amsterdam, the Bonapartes are waiting. And in the frozen forests of Russia, an army is gathering that will test not just Napoleon's generalship, but the loyalty of the family he built to rule the world. The crown of iron is heavier than any man can bear alone. And soon, Napoleon will discover that the family he made in his image will not carry it with him into the dark. The river Neman separates Europe from the dream of empire. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon stands on its western bank, watching his army cross the bridge of pontoons that spans the muddy water. The Grande Armée is the largest force ever assembled under a single command, nearly 600,000 men, drawn from every corner of his empire and his alliances. Germans, Poles, Italians, Dutch, Swiss, and French march together under their columns stretching for miles along the road to Vilnius. The emperor wears the uniform of the chasseur à cheval, a simple gray coat over his white riding breeches, his famous bicorn hat pulled low against the sun. He is 42 years old. He has conquered Italy, Egypt, Austria, Prussia, Spain. He has remade the map of Europe in the image of his ambition. Now he is marching to Moscow, to force Tsar Alexander back into the continental system, to humble the last great power that dares defy him. He does not know that he is marching to his death, not his death alone, but the death of everything he has built. Behind him, in the palaces of Paris, his family waits. Joseph sits uneasily on the throne of Spain, his kingdom a bleeding wound of guerrilla warfare. Louis broods in exile, his Dutch kingdom taken from him for the sin of loving his subjects more than he loved the continental system. Jerome, the youngest, commands a corps in the invasion, eager to prove himself worthy of his Westphalian crown. Caroline and Murat rule Naples, their loyalty to Napoleon measured against their ambition for more. And Letizia, the mother, remains in Rome, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She has seen empires rise before. She knows how quickly they can fall. The advance into Russia is a logistical nightmare from the first week. The roads are dirt tracks that dissolve into mud under the boots of 600,000 men. The supply wagons cannot keep pace. The horses, fed on green wheat, die by the thousands. The heat is oppressive, the dust suffocating. Men fall out of the ranks, their lungs filled with the fine powder of Russian roads, their eyes swollen with the flies that breed in the carcasses of dead animals lining the route. Napoleon pushes forward anyway. He believes in speed, in the decisive battle that will end the war in a single afternoon. He has always believed that. It has never failed him. But Russia does not fight the decisive battle. The Russian armies retreat, drawing Napoleon deep into the vast, empty country. They burn their own villages, poison their own wells, destroy their own crops rather than let them feed the invader. The Tsar's generals, Barclay de Tolly and the aged Kutuzov, know what Napoleon refuses to understand, that Russia is not a country to be conquered by a single battle. It is a space to be endured. The French army marches through a wasteland of its own making, each step forward a step away from its supply line, each day bringing the army closer to the winter that waits in the east. Jerome's corps is the first to falter. At the pursuit of the Russian army toward Vitebsk, Jerome hesitates. He misses an opportunity to cut off the Russian retreat, allowing the enemy to slip away. Napoleon's dispatch to his youngest brother is brutal, stripped of the familial affection that might have softened the blow. The emperor expresses his extreme displeasure with the king of Westphalia. The order His Majesty orders the king to rejoin his corps without delay and to conduct himself in a manner befitting a soldier. Jerome, humiliated, abandons his command and retreats to Westphalia. He will not fight again in this campaign. The first Bonaparte has failed the test of battle, and his failure is a wound that will never fully heal. The battle Napoleon craves finally comes on September 7 at Borodino. It is the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars, a slaughter that leaves both armies broken. The French take the field, but at the cost of 44,000 casualties. The Russians withdraw in good order, their army intact, their will unbroken. Napoleon sits in his headquarters that night, the reports of the dead arriving by candlelight. His generals urge him to pursue, to finish what Borodino began. He does not move. Some say he is ill, his hemorrhoids preventing him from riding. Others say the scale of the slaughter has shaken. The truth may be simpler. He has never faced an enemy that would not break. He has never faced a war that could not be won in a single afternoon. He is learning too late that some enemies are not beaten by battles. Moscow is empty when the French enter on September 14. The city that Napoleon expected to yield its submission is a ghost town of abandoned palaces and looted churches. The governor, Count Rostopchin, has ordered the city burned. Within days, 3/4 of Moscow is ash, the wooden buildings feeding a fire that turns the sky orange and red, the heat so intense that the French camp in the fields outside the walls. Napoleon installs himself in the Kremlin, waiting for Tsar Alexander to sue for peace. He waits 5 weeks. The letters he writes to the Tsar go unanswered. The Russian winter arrives early, the snows blanketing the ruined city, the temperatures dropping to 20 degrees below freezing. The retreat begins on October 19. It is not a military operation. It is a catastrophe. 110,000 men leave Moscow with Napoleon. By the time they cross the Berezina River in late November, only 27,000 are still under arms. The cold kills more than the Cossacks. The horses die first, their frozen carcasses lining the road, then the men. They die of exhaustion, of dysentery, of the cold that seeps through their threadbare coats and freezes the water in their canteens. They die at night, curled around campfires that offer no warmth, their bodies stiffening by morning. They die on the march, falling out of the column to lie in the snow, their comrades too weak to lift them, too numb to mourn. Napoleon marches with. He wears a Polish fur coat now, a sable cap pulled over his ears, his hands wrapped in the wool of a shepherd's cloak. He walks most days because his horse has died and the roads are too icy for a carriage. He does not eat more than his men, does not sleep in a bed when they sleep in the snow. But he is not one of them. He is the emperor, and the emperor must survive. In early December at Smorgoni, he makes the decision that will define the rest of his life. He leaves the army. He hands command to Murat, his sister Caroline's husband, and slips away in a sleigh, heading west through the frozen night toward Paris. He tells his generals he must reach the capital before the news of the disaster, must raise new armies, must save the empire. It is true, but it is also an abandonment. The men who marched with him from Moscow, the survivors who struggle through the snow toward the Polish frontier, will remember that their emperor left them in the cold. The sleigh carries Napoleon across Europe, through Warsaw, through Dresden, through the German states that are already beginning to turn against him. He reaches Paris on December 18, just after midnight. He bursts into the Tuileries, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow, his clothes still stained with the mud of the retreat. Marie-Louise, his young Austrian wife, does not recognize him at first. She screams when he enters her chamber, thinking he is a ghost, a specter of the man who left for Russia 6 months before. He holds her, holds the infant king of Rome, and tells them everything is fine. It is a lie. The empire is bleeding, the army is destroyed, and the family he built to rule Europe is beginning to fracture. Murat, left in command of the remnants of the Grand Armée, does not hold. He abandons the survivors to the Cossacks and retreats to Naples, where he begins secret negotiations with the Allies. Caroline, his wife, writes letters to her brother urging him to come to terms, to accept the inevitable. Napoleon reads her words and sees betrayal. His sister, the child he carried out of Corsica, the woman he made a queen, is bargaining with his enemies while he fights for the empire's survival. Joseph from Spain writes of his own troubles, his kingdom collapsing around him, his generals defeated by Wellington's British army. Jerome, humiliated by his failure in Russia, sends no word at all. The year 1813 is a year of desperation. Napoleon raises new armies from the boys of France, the conscripts of 1814 who march to the front with their faces still soft, their hands still smooth from the plow. He wins battles again, at Lutzen, at Bautzen, at Dresden, but he cannot replace the men he loses. The Allies, learning from his own playbook, refuse to make peace. They retreat when he advances, advance when he retreats, always avoiding the decisive battle that might end the war. At Leipzig, in October, the Battle of the Nations shatters what remains of Napoleon's German Empire. The French retreat across the Rhine, the empire that stretched from Spain to Poland, collapsing into the pre-revolutionary borders of France, and still the family fractures. Murat, having secured his throne in Naples by betraying Napoleon, marches north with the Austrian army to fight against his former emperor. Joseph, driven from Spain, retreats to Paris, his kingdom lost, his pride shattered. Louis, in exile, watches from a distance, his bitterness now a cold comfort. Lucien, the brother who saved Napoleon at Brumaire, remains in Italy, his wife Alexandrine at his side, his defiance intact. The family that was an arsenal has become a collection of refugees, each sibling clinging to what they can salvage from the wreckage of Napoleon's ambition. The invasion of France comes in January 1814. The Allies cross the Rhine, the Russian, Prussian, Austrian, and British armies advancing on Paris from all directions. Napoleon fights the most brilliant campaign of his career, maneuvering his small, exhausted army against forces 10 times its size. He wins at Champaubert, at Montreal, at Vauchamps, at Montereau. The French countryside, occupied by foreign armies for the first time in 20 years, rallies to him. For a moment, it seems possible that he might save France, might drive the invaders back across the Rhine, might rebuild the empire from the ashes of its destruction. But Paris falls. On March 31, the Allies enter the capital, the gates opened by politicians who have decided that Napoleon's ambition has cost France too much. Joseph, who was entrusted with the defense of the city, flees with his family, leaving the palace of the Tuileries to be occupied by Cossacks. Marie-Louise takes the King of Rome and flees south, to Blois, then to Austria, where her father will keep her and her son as hostage of the peace. When Napoleon, racing back from his victories in the east, reaches the outskirts of Paris, he finds the gates closed, the bridges guarded, the city he built in his image surrendered without a fight. He retreats to Fontainebleau, the palace where he divorced Josephine, where he planned the invasion of Russia, where he believed his dynasty would rule for 1,000 years. His marshals, the men who followed him across Europe, gather in the courtyard. They are exhausted, they are defeated. They tell him what he already knows: the army will not march on Paris. The war is lost. The empire is finished. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicates the throne of France. He signs the document in the same study where he once wrote love letters to Josephine, his hand steady, his face a mask that reveals nothing. In his pocket, he carries a small vial of poison. He had it prepared after the retreat from Russia, a final escape from capture, from humiliation, from the judgment of his enemy. That night, alone in the palace of Fontainebleau, he takes it. The poison has lost its potency over the years. It burns his throat, makes him retch, twists his stomach into knots, but it does not kill him. He lies on the floor of his study, his body convulsing, his mind drifting back to the stone floor of Ajaccio, his mother's silhouette against the window, the fire spitting in the hearth. He wanted to be the one who never knelt. Now he lies on the floor, a failed emperor, a man who poisoned himself and could not even succeed at dying. The Allies give him Elba, a tiny island off the coast of Italy, a speck on the map of the Mediterranean that once belonged to his mother's family. They give him a sovereignty that is a mockery of the empire he lost, a palace of 2 rooms, a navy of a single brig. They expect him to disappear, to fade into obscurity, to become a footnote in the history of Europe. They do not understand what Letizia knew when she fled Corsica, what Josephine knew when she knelt in the Tuileries, what the Bonapartes know in their blood. This family does not fade. It does not accept defeat. It waits. In the harbor of Portoferreo on the island of Elba, Napoleon stands on the dock, watching the mainland. The sun sets over the Mediterranean, the same sea that carried his family from Corsica, that carried him to Egypt, that carried him to glory and to ruin. He is emperor of nothing. He is king of a rock, but in his eyes the fire has not gone out. He is waiting, and soon the family will gather again. The last act is about to begin. The snows of winter have barely melted from the passes of the Alps when the news reaches Vienna. The Congress of Vienna, the gathering of Europe's victorious powers, has been dancing and debating for months, redrawing the map of the continent while the man who remade it rots on his island prison. The ambassadors are arguing over Poland, over Saxony, over the indemnities France must pay for 20 years of war. They are not arguing about Napoleon Bonaparte. They believe he is finished. They believe the name Bonaparte is a cautionary tale, a warning to ambitious men who reach too high and fall too far. On March 7, 1815, a messenger bursts into the ballroom of the Austrian chancellor. He is covered in mud, his horse lathered with sweat, his eyes wide with a terror that stops the music. The emperor has landed, he gasps. Bonaparte has escaped Elba. He is marching on Paris. The man who walks out of the Mediterranean is not the defeated emperor who swallowed poison at Fontainebleau. He is something older, something harder, something stripped of the gilded trappings that weighed down his crown. He lands at Galfouan on March 1 with fewer than 1,000 men, the old guard of his imperial guard who chose exile over surrender. He carries no crown, no scepter, no purple robes. He wears the gray coat of the chasseur, the bicorn hat pulled low, the same uniform he wore when he crossed the Neman 3 years before. He carries only his name, and in France, that name is still gunpowder. March North is a masterclass in the theater of power. The soldiers sent to arrest him do not fire. They look at the small man in the gray coat, the man who led them across the Alps through the sands of Egypt into the frozen heart of Russia, and they cannot raise their muskets. Napoleon walks toward them alone, his coat open, his hands empty. "Soldiers of the 5th Regiment," he calls out, his voice carrying across the field. "If there is one among you who wishes to kill his emperor, let him fire now." There is a moment of silence, the air thick with the weight of 20 years of glory and suffering. Then the soldiers break. They throw down their muskets. They rush toward him, weeping, cheering, lifting him onto their shoulders. The man who was emperor of nothing becomes emperor of France again, simply by walking. Louis XVI, the Bourbon king placed on the throne by the Allies, flees Paris in the night, his courtiers scattering like leaves before a winter wind. On March 20, Napoleon enters the Tuileries once more. He has traveled from the Mediterranean to Paris in 20 days, without firing a shot, without losing a man. The 100 days have begun. The family, scattered across Europe, watches with a mixture of hope and calculation. Joseph, who fled Spain, who fled Paris, returns immediately, his loyalty to his brother surviving all the humiliations of the past year. Louis, the brother who loved Holland too much to serve Napoleon's blockade, remains in exile, his heart too hardened by old wounds. Jerome, the youngest, the one who failed in Russia, arrives with his Westphalian guards, eager for redemption. Caroline and Murat, the betrayers who marched with the Austrians against France, hesitate. They have tasted independent power. They cannot decide which side will win, and in their hesitation they lose everything. Letizia, the mother, remains in Rome. When the news of Napoleon's return reaches her, she does not smile. She does not weep. She folds her hands and says nothing. She has seen too much to trust the turn of the weak. Allies do not hesitate. They declare Napoleon an outlaw, an enemy of humanity, a man outside the protection of law and civilization. The armies that defeated him in 1814 are gathering again. Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia. They will not negotiate, will not accept his return, will not rest until he is removed from the throne of France. Napoleon knows he has one chance. He must strike before the Allies can coordinate, must destroy their armies one by one before they unite against him. He raises an army from the veterans of his old campaign, from the young men who have never known a France without his shadow. In June, he marches north into Belgium, where the British army under Wellington and the Prussian army under Blücher are camped, waiting for the signal to invade France. The campaign begins with brilliance. At Ligny on June 16, Napoleon defeats the Prussians, driving them back toward their supply lines. At Quatre Bras the same day, his Marshal Ney fights Wellington's British to a standstill. The Prussians are broken, the British are isolated. If Napoleon can crush Wellington before the Prussians regroup, the campaign is over. He turns toward Waterloo. The rain falls on June 17, a relentless downpour that turns the fields of Belgium into a quagmire. Napoleon spends the night in a farmhouse at Creole, studying the maps, calculating the probability. He sends orders to his subordinate Grouchy to pursue the Prussians, to prevent them from reinforcing Wellington. He tells his generals that the battle tomorrow will be easy. Wellington is a bad general, he says. The British are bad soldiers. This will be a simple affair. On the morning of June 18, the sun rises over the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, where Wellington has placed his army. The ground is still wet. the field slick with mud that will slow the infantry, bog down the cavalry, turn the artillery into immobile fortresses. Napoleon hesitates. He waits for the ground to dry, waits for the sun to bake the mud into something his horses can cross. He waits until 11 in the morning. In the years to come, historians will debate those hours. Could he have won if he attacked at dawn? Could he have broken Wellington before the Prussians arrived? The questions are the ghosts of Waterloo, the spirits that haunted Napoleon for the 6 years he had left to live. The battle begins with an assault on the Château de Hougoumont, a farmhouse on Wellington's right flank. The fighting there will last all day. The British guards holding the walls against wave after wave of French infantry, the Château burning, the gardens running with blood. Napoleon watches from his command post at La Belle Alliance, a low hill a mile from the British line. He sends his infantry in column, the massive formations that broke armies at Austerlitz and Jena. Wellington has hidden his men behind the reverse slope of the ridge, and the French columns march into a killing ground. The British infantry rise from their positions, fire a single volley at close range, and charge with the bayonet. The French columns shatter. The survivors stream back toward their lines, their officers screaming for order, their flags captured, their pride shredded. The afternoon is a series of hammer blows. The French cavalry charges again and again, the great squadrons of cuirassiers and lancers thundering across the valley, their armor glinting in the afternoon sun. They ride up the ridge through the British squares, the infantry standing shoulder to shoulder, their bayonets forming walls of steel that the horses will not charge. The cavalry breaks against those squares like waves against a cliff, the horses screaming, the men falling, the ground carpeted with the dead and dying. Napoleon watches through his telescope, his face gray, his hands trembling. He has no reserves. The men he sent to pursue the Prussians have not returned. The Prussians themselves are coming. At 4 in the afternoon, the first Prussian columns appear on Napoleon's right flank. They have eluded Grouchy, marching through the night and the rain to reach Wellington. Blücher, the old Prussian commander, is 72 years old. He has been thrown from his horse, trampled, left for dead. He rides into battle anyway, his white hair flying, his sword raised, calling his men forward. "Forward, children," he shouts. "Forward, I say. We must beat them or the game is up. The game is already up." Napoleon knows it. He has one last card to play. He sends the Imperial Guard, the elite of the elite, the veterans of 100 battles who have never been broken. They march forward at 8 in the evening, their bearskin caps towering above the smoke, their blue coats stained with the dust and blood of the long day. They march up the ridge toward the British line, and Wellington, from his position behind a tree, gives the order. The British guards, hidden in a hollow, rise and fire. The Imperial Guard recoils. For the first time in its history, the Guard retreats. The cry goes up from the British line, from the Prussian flank, from the French rear, where the survivors are already fleeing toward the road to Paris. La Garde recule, sauve qui peut. The Guard retreats. Save yourself if you can. Napoleon does not leave the field until the last light has faded. He tries to rally the remnants of the Guard, forms a square around La Belle Alliance, holds off the pursuing cavalry while the army disintegrates around him. His generals beg him to flee, to save himself for France, to fight another day. He will not move. He stands in the square, his arms folded, his face turned toward the British line, as if waiting for a bullet that will end everything. In the end, his generals drag him away, pushing him into a carriage, driving him south toward Paris. Behind him, the field of Waterloo is a sea of bodies, 45,000 men killed or wounded in a single day, the hopes of the 100 days rotting in the summer heat. He returns to Paris on June 21, 3 days after the battle. The Chamber of Deputies, the same body that welcomed him back in March, now demands his abdication. They will not fight. They will not rally. They have seen the end, and they will not go down with him. Napoleon drafts the abdication in the same study at the Tuileries where he once planned the invasion of Russia, where he divorced Josephine, where he held the infant king of Rome and believed in a 1,000-year dynasty. He writes the words without emotion. My political life is finished. He attempts to flee to America, to escape to the United States, to begin again in a land without emperors and coalitions. The British blockade catches him at Rochefort on the Atlantic coast. He surrenders to Captain Maitland of HMS Bellerophon, standing on the deck of the British ship in his gray coat, his bicorn hat in his hand. He writes a letter to the Prince Regent of England, asking for asylum, asking for a cottage in the countryside, asking for nothing but peace. The British give him a rock. St. Helena is an island of volcanic rock in the South Atlantic, 2,000 miles from the coast of Africa, 1,800 miles from Brazil. It is the most isolated place on Earth, a fortress of cliffs and winds that the British chose for its inaccessibility. Napoleon arrives in October 1815, after 2 months at sea. He is given a residence at Longwood, a damp, rat-infested farmhouse that the British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, refuses to improve. The climate is unhealthy, the food is poor, the isolation is absolute. Napoleon spends his days dictating his memoirs to his companion, the loyal generals who followed him into exile, Bertrand, Monthal, and Gergaud. He sits in the garden when the weather permits, watching the sea, the empty horizon that offers no sail, no hope, no escape. He writes about his campaigns, refighting the battles in his mind, explaining the decisions, justifying the losses. He creates the myth of Napoleon, the legend that will outlive the man. The family cannot reach him. Joseph, who fled Paris after Waterloo, makes his way to America, settling in Philadelphia, then in New Jersey, living on the money he managed to salvage from the ruins of the empire. Louis, the brother who could not forgive, dies in Italy, his bitterness unresolved. Jerome returns to France after the Bourbon Restoration, marrying an American heiress, rebuilding his life in the country that his brother once ruled. Caroline loses Naples, loses her throne, lives in exile in Austria, the betrayal of 1814 forgotten or forgiven. Pauline, the beautiful sister who loved Napoleon above all her husbands, travels to St. Helena, begging the British for permission to join her brother in exile. They refuse. She waits in Italy, sending letters that he never receives, dying of tuberculosis while he fades on his rock. Lucien, the brother who defied Napoleon for love, outlives them all. He returns to France after the fall, becomes a prince of the papal court, lives in Rome with his Alexandrine, his defiance turned to peace. He writes his own memoirs, his own version of the family's story, preserving the memory of the night he saved Napoleon at Brumaire, the night he chose his brother over the Republic, the night he chose love over the empire. He never reconciles with Letizia. The mother sits in Rome in the palace Napoleon bought her, her accounts in order, her gold hidden, her silence absolute. She receives the news of Napoleon's death with the same face she wore when the French soldiers marched through Ajaccio, when the boat carried her from Corsica, when her sons became kings. She folds her hands. She says nothing. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte dies at Longwood. He is 51 years old. The cause is stomach cancer, the same disease that killed his father, or arsenic poisoning from the wallpaper in the damp farmhouse, or the slow poison of exile and defeat. He speaks his last words in French or in Italian or in Corsican, depending on which of his companions is telling the story. France, armée, tête d'armée, Josephine. France, army, head of the army, Josephine. The names of his loves, spoken together at the end. He leaves behind a will that divides his property among his surviving sibling, that names Joseph as his heir, that asks to be buried on the banks of the Seine. The British bury him on St. Helena, under a slab of stone with no name, in a valley of willows that weep in the constant wind. The legacy of the House of Bonaparte does not end with the death of the emperor. It survives in the children he made, in the names he elevated, in the memory he cultivated in his exile. His son, the King of Rome, is a prisoner in Vienna, raised as a Habsburg, taught to forget his father, given the Austrian title of Duke of Reichstadt. He never rules France. He dies of tuberculosis at 21, a young man in a palace he never wanted, his father's blood running in his vein, his father's name forbidden on his lips. But the name survived. It survives in the nephew and the cousins, in the families that spread across Europe and America, carrying the blood of Ajaccio into the new century. 40 years after Napoleon's death, another Bonaparte takes the throne of France. Louis Napoleon, the son of Louis and Hortense, the nephew of the emperor, is elected president of the Second Republic in 1848. 3 years later, he seizes power in a coup, proclaims himself Emperor Napoleon III, and rules France for 2 decades, until the Prussians destroy his empire at Sedan in 1870. The dynasty returns to France as if the emperor's ghost has never stopped walking. In the end, the House of Bonaparte is not a story of a single man. It is a story of a family that carried a name from the rocky hills of Corsica to the thrones of Europe, that built an empire on ambition and lost it on the fields of Russia and Waterloo, that survived exile and poverty to rise again when no one expected it. Napoleon made them kings and queens, princes and princesses, the equals of the oldest blood in Europe. He bound them to him with titles and lands, with commands and threats, with the shared memory of the boy who knelt on the stone floor in Ajaccio, tracing the grooves between the stones, vowing to never kneel again. They failed him, some of them. They betrayed him, some of them. But they never forgot his name. And in the long history of Europe, the name Bonaparte never fades. Letizia lives until 1836, long enough to see the first stirrings of the Bonapartist revival, long enough to know that her sons and daughters have scattered across the world, that her grandchildren carry the name in future she cannot imagine. She dies in Rome, in the palace her son bought her, her accounts still in order, her gold still hidden, her silence finally broken only by the priest who hears her last confession. She asks to be buried in the habit of a Carmelite nun, the clothes she wore in the hard years, the years before the crowns and the thrones, the years when she was only Letizia, the mother of a family that had nothing but each other and the memory of a homeland lost to the sea. They lay her in the ground, and the name Bonaparte passes to the next generation, and the next, and the next. The family endures, the legacy endures, and somewhere in the hills of Corsica, in the palaces of Paris, in the valleys of St. Helena, the ghost of the emperor watches, his hand still tracing the grooves in the stone, his eyes still fixed on the horizon, waiting for the sun that will never set on his house.